In a brutal clash between the White Tower's elite mages and a unified demonic force, humanity's future hung by a thread. The demon army, led by the High Priest of Extinction, faced off against Oscar Sage, a level 9 mage and master of the tower. Oscar, backed by his disciples, managed to crush the invasion, but at a devastating price. With a hole in his chest and blood pooling beneath him, Oscar cast a final detection spell, hoping for signs of life. He received no response. Everyone was gone. He was alone, and not for much longer. Edna Solaplas, the last dragon in history's observer, appeared to assess the damage. She reported 132 level 6 mages, 19 level 7s, and 2 level 8s dead. The tower lay in ruins. Their research, gone. But she added that Imperial forces had arrived early, saving a few survivors. Oscar's personal disciples among them. Oscar was relieved. With his last breath, he told Edna to protect them. He trusted her. She bowed in agreement, and Oscar, amused, joked about a dragon bowing to a human. Edna replied that he had earned it. Oscar died at 3:47 p.m. on April 28. History would remember him as a powerful mage, though he died regretting that he was never a good leader. If he had another chance, he vowed to live selfishly, for his people. And then, against all logic, he did. 20 years later, Oscar woke up in a stranger's body. A falling leaf touched his skin, and he bolted upright, accidentally smacking the man next to him with his hand. Water flew everywhere. Frank, his caretaker, shouted that he didn't deserve this kind of crap after caring for Oscar. All he wanted was to change a towel. He told Oscar to fix his reckless sleeping habits and maybe show a little appreciation. Oscar ignored the scolding. His thoughts raced. Why was he alive? Last he remembered, he was dying, skewered by the High Priest. Then, a door slammed open. Elder Maxim stormed in without knocking. Frank tried to calm him, but Maxim wasn't listening. He shouted that it was time to turn Oscar into a proper human being and called him pathetic. Oscar asked how he was alive. Maxim found it amusing that Oscar, even now, realized he was the kind of cockroach who always escaped death. Oscar noticed their robes. These two were White Tower mages. He demanded an explanation. That sent Maxim into a rage. He raised his hand, ready to slap Oscar into next week. Oscar reflexively cast a windshield spell, confident it would break Maxim's wrist. But the barrier flickered out before Maxim's hand even touched it. Oscar panicked. His magic was weak, far too weak. Still, the half-formed spell was enough to make Maxim pause. Surprisingly, Maxim seemed pleased. He said Oscar hadn't been completely lazy, and for now, he'd hold off on punishing him for embezzling research funds. He told Oscar to rest and stormed out. Frank, still wet, couldn't believe the nerve Oscar had. One wrong word and he'd have been flattened. Oscar didn't hear him. He was busy trying to figure out what had happened to his magic. His circuits were wrecked. Monolevels and purity were trash. He finally asked Frank what day it was. Frank replied, annoyed. It was September 21st. Oscar panicked. That meant he'd been out for 5 months. But Frank corrected him. It had only been a day. Oscar didn't like that answer either, but whatever. He told Frank to summon Lloyd. If not Lloyd, then Gila or Shasha. Frank stared. Did Oscar hit his head too hard? Those were the names of disgraced mages. Lloyd had joined the Red Tower. Gila stole a high-level spellbook, and only Shasha remained, now the Mage Tower Master. Oscar was furious. He denied the accusations, but Frank's sincerity made him pause. Could it be true? He demanded clarification. Shasha was a 5-year-old when he died. How could she be a Tower Master? Frank corrected him again. Shasha was 25 now. That's when reality started to hit. Oscar caught his reflection in the window. The face staring back wasn't his. He wasn't in his body anymore. He'd been thrown 20 years into the future, and the world had changed. Electricity, cars, and magic engineering had reshaped everything. It was a world his old comrades would have marveled at. In the ashes of despair, something remarkable had grown. He began to investigate the body he now inhabited. Oscar Crushen, age 20. A fallen noble's son, taken in by the White Tower at age 10. A level 1 mage with a decent face, but terrible magical potential. Apparently, the kid embezzled funds to buy an illegal elixir, hoping to boost his mana. Instead, he collapsed. Frank said he'd only been unconscious a day. But considering the dosage, he should have died. Oscar scanned his body. It held an abnormal amount of unrefined, pure mana. Way too much for a level 1 mage. Then something odd happened. Black gunk formed in his chest, slid down his arm, and dropped from his fingertip. The floor hissed where it landed. Poison. It all clicked. The elixir was real and powerful, but also poisoned. Crushin didn't die from mana overload. He was murdered. And the poison dosage was far too high for a low-level mage. Someone had wanted him dead, no mistakes. Oscar didn't know who set this all up, or why, but one thing was clear. He had been given the second chance he once wished for. He swore not to waste it. He'd live selfishly, for his people this time. He owed the body's original owner a debt, and he intended to repay it, with vengeance. Elsewhere, chaos brewed. A mage had destroyed part of the city. The boss of an illicit shop screamed at his servant, demanding to know who had the balls to attack his store. The servant hesitated before revealing that the attacker was the same man who bought the illegal elixir, Oscar Crushin. The boss didn't believe it. A level 1 runt couldn't possibly defeat his guards. Not unless the elixir actually worked. The servant warned that if the White Tower caught wind of this, they were screwed. But the boss wasn't worried. He'd seen the poison ring on the hand of the one who wanted Oscar dead. A White Tower mage. The shop boss and his lackey froze in shock. Oscar stood right in front of them, having clearly overheard their entire conversation. He had tracked the faint scent lingering in the elixir bottle straight to their location. Now, after hearing more than he bargained for, Oscar realized this conspiracy was deeper than expected. Still, he was determined to see it through. The boss tried to intimidate him, demanding to know if he was the one who destroyed the store. Oscar admitted it without hesitation and ordered them to continue their conversation, saying he was curious to hear more. The boss, now furious, changed his mind about letting Oscar walk. He barked at his lackey to kill him. The underling didn't hesitate. With a grin, he charged. Oscar raised his hand and cast Windcutter. A sharp blade of air cleaved the man's throat, clean and final. The body dropped. The death reminded Oscar of how he'd once killed the high priest. The boss, now panicking, pulled a gun and fired. Oscar, more curious than afraid, cast a windshield. He was intrigued. This small device emitted such destructive power without any mana. The bullet stopped midair. Then, with a flick of his fingers, Oscar reversed the wind and sent the bullet back into the man's body. Several rounds pierced the boss, dropping him instantly. Oscar told the man not to expect help. No sound could escape this room. The boss, confused, questioned how level 1 mage could cast silence magic. Oscar corrected him. It wasn't silence, but soundbind. A technique that prevented sound from leaving, not from existing. With that clarified, Oscar got to the point. He wanted answers. First, who had ordered the hit? The boss refused, so Oscar kicked him across the face. He noted how the man valued pride over pain, but that wouldn't save him. Oscar channeled wind into his body. Tiny blades stabbing him from within. The man writhed on the ground, his face twisted in agony. Eventually, he begged Oscar to stop and promised to talk. Oscar allowed it. The boss admitted that a hooded man had given them the elixir and some money, instructing them to sell it to Oscar cheap. They only agreed because the man didn't tolerate refusal. The man wore a White Tower ring, but Oscar suspected that was intentional misdirection. Oscar asked how the man smelled. The boss described it as crisp and minty, distinct, unforgettable. Oscar memorized the detail. Next, Oscar wanted to know how the shop intended to deal with the aftermath of poisoning a mage. The boss shrugged, saying the White Tower was too busy with the withdrawal from the 4 main towers to investigate anything properly. That caught Oscar's attention. He pressed for more. The boss seemed surprised that someone from the tower didn't know such basic internal affairs. Oscar claimed memory loss from the elixir. Accepting that excuse, the man handed over several documents explaining everything. Oscar scanned the papers. April 28th had been declared the Day of the White Knight in honor of Oscar Sage's death and the defeat of the High Priest. The Emperor had rewarded the White Tower with a 30-year tax exemption. But despite this, the tower had produced the worst results last year. 20 years after the war, it still hadn't recovered. Oscar was stunned. He remembered giving Edna crucial documents to prevent this exact collapse. He made a mental note to investigate further. The final pages detailed the tower's business failures. Curious, Oscar asked what kind of businesses the four towers were running now. The boss broke it down. The Yellow Tower of the East controlled lightning and pioneered the magic engineering boom. They created things like street lamps and vehicles. The Blue Tower of the South had cornered the potion market and expanded into agriculture and clean water distribution. The Red Tower in the desert had joined the military, helping with monster subjugation. As for the White Tower, they delivered mail. Oscar was speechless. Deliveries? With Wind Riders acting like postal birds? The boss explained they had a logistical edge, flying fast and safe. But to Oscar, it was disgraceful. The White Tower had once symbolized freedom, like dragons in the sky. Now it was reduced to a glorified courier service. He asked who approved such humiliation. The answer crushed him: Shasha, his own disciple and current tower master. Oscar didn't know what was worse, the betrayal of legacy or the fact that he had trained the one responsible. Shaking off the disappointment, he inquired about the Blue Tower's unusual businesses: selling water, managing agriculture. The boss explained that they controlled rainfall for drought regions and sold purified water at premium prices. Rich idiots were falling over themselves for it. Oscar thought it was absurd. Water was free. Wells existed. But apparently, luxury had found new meaning. With everything laid out, Oscar finally understood how far the White Tower had fallen. While the others built empires, the White Tower was scrambling to stay relevant. And with the White Night Festival only 7 months away, this might be their last chance to prove they still mattered. The shop owner trembled on the ground, his body racked with pain and blood loss. His limbs were growing cold, and death wasn't far. Oscar hesitated. The bastard had fed him the answers he needed, but did that make him worth saving? Before deciding, Oscar flipped through the man's ledger. What he saw settled it. Pages filled with detailed records of arson, assaults, illegal loans, extortion, and contract killings. Every dirty deed this scumbag ever touched was scribbled in black ink. Disgusted, Oscar walked to the edge of the building and jumped, leaving the man to bleed out alone. If there was justice in the next life, maybe he'd come back better. That night, Oscar returned to the White Tower, his body exhausted. Just a handful of low-level spells had drained him like he'd run a marathon. It was pathetic, and worrisome. If his current body couldn't handle basic spells, how would it survive the advanced wind archive magic that made him legendary? He tried the archive magic. Nothing. It vanished on cast. Clearly, he needed to assess the situation properly. First step: a full body scan. While the scan ran, he pulled out Oscar Crescen's profile book. Understanding the boy's past might reveal what he was working with. Crescen had once been the heir to Count Crescen, the only survivor of a mansion fire. The magic world hailed him as a prodigy. Top marks at the Empire Academy. A groundbreaking thesis. Countless factions competed for him. But then came the strange twist. Despite all this, he remained a level 1 mage. Oscar soon found the reason. Oscar Crescen had been diagnosed with mana deficiency syndrome. It finally clicked. The boy had brilliance but no outlet. A mage's mind trapped in a broken body. The scan results came in, and Oscar's eyes widened. It wasn't mana deficiency syndrome. Someone had deliberately sealed his circuits. Mana deficiency syndrome meant a person couldn't circulate or store mana. Normally, mages developed up to 20 physical circuits layered on top of their mana circuit. These determined their level. But if the foundation was broken, you could train forever and never break past level 3. Oscar Crescen's foundation wasn't broken, it had been tied down. Someone did this to him. Oscar suspected the boy had known. If he was as smart as his records said, he must have realized the truth. Maybe that was why he adopted the persona of an alcoholic, to throw his enemies off. Maybe he'd known he was a target and decided to act broken rather than reveal the truth. But that didn't explain why, in the end, he risked it all for an illegal elixir. Oscar figured it didn't matter. The same way he once clawed his way through a collapsing world, he would now undo these knots himself. He had no one else to trust anyway. He sifted through the books Oscar Crescen left behind: notes, theories, research. One title caught his eye: The Reinterpretation of Basic Magic. The pages were dense with scribbles and insights. Crescen had picked apart the structure of spells, reworked formulas, and explored how to adapt them to real-world situations. He even analyzed firearms and compared their effectiveness to magic. Oscar was blown away. The ideas mirrored his own techniques: advanced wind spell applications, alternative casting theories, multi-purpose spells. Krushin had even developed entirely new beginner-level spells from scratch, purely as thought experiments. For someone who couldn't use magic, he had pushed himself further than most ever dared. There was one passage that stood out, a single, hopeful quote. Krushin had written that he hoped this book could at least carry a weak breeze toward the White Tower, left behind by a mage facing his final challenge. It was clear. He had walked a lonely path, unrecognized and hunted, but never gave up. Oscar closed the book with a new resolve. As the 17th Master of the White Tower, he would break the seal Oscar Krushin couldn't, and make the bastards responsible pay. Later, Oscar found himself wandering a greenhouse. He had no idea how he got there, until he realized he was dreaming. The exhaustion from trying to break the seal must have knocked him out. A familiar voice rang out. He was reliving a memory, his past life. The dream curse. The Viscount of Nightmares from the demon realm had placed it on his soul. It forced him to revisit the past every time he slept. He had hoped switching bodies would end it, but the curse clung to the soul, not the flesh. Still, it was good to see his old disciples again. In the dream, he stood before the children. Lloyd Schultz, 9 years old, black-haired and quiet. Sasha Mast, red-haired and 5, curious and bright. And Jillian Dominic, 7, golden-haired and bursting with energy. Oscar lectured them on the 4 core types of magic: enchantment, acceleration, balance, and special type. Though spells may look similar, their structures and functions aligned with different categories. The White Tower favored balance-type magic, and wind magic suited it best. Each tower had its own affinity. The Golden Tower pursued acceleration, pure speed. The Red Tower, rooted in the desert, specialized in enchantment with fire. The Azure and White Towers focused on balance. Jillian, eager and blunt, said he wanted to learn acceleration magic because anything slow was a waste of time. Oscar corrected him, saying that magic affinity wasn't a matter of preference, it was innate. A mage had to discover their own. Sasha asked how to find it. Oscar responded by drawing a magic circle on the ground and instructing her to place her finger on the glyph and try casting the spell written within. Sasha, wide-eyed and curious, hesitated at the unfamiliar spell Oscar had drawn. But when she touched it, mana shimmered at her fingertip, steady and calm. Oscar noted it immediately: balanced, non-lethal. She was harmonization type, just like him. Overjoyed, Sasha celebrated having the same affinity as her master. Next, Jillian tested his affinity. A burst of quick, sharp mana answered: acceleration type, exactly what he'd hoped for. The kid could barely contain his excitement. Then came Lloyd. His mana bloomed into the form of a delicate flower. Special type. Oscar recognized it instantly, an extremely rare affinity found in only 2 of every 1,000 mages. Yet Lloyd looked unsure and quietly asked if he could change it. Oscar found the question odd. Special type was a gift. But Lloyd's reason was simple: he just wanted to be like his master. Oscar smiled, amused and touched. He said he'd look into it, though he already planned to prioritize Lloyd's training. Hearing this, Lloyd's doubts faded. The promise of private lessons from Oscar himself sealed the deal. But just to be sure, he asked for a pinky promise. Oscar remembered that moment well. Lloyd had always been called the Promise Man for a reason. Then, a loud announcement pulled him from the dream. The broadcast summoned him to Lab 4202. As he made his way through the tower, he reflected on his progress: 12 physical circuits unlocked, 8 left, and 2 mana circuit lines gained. He was officially a level 2 mage. Inside the lab, Elder Maxim waited. He greeted Oscar and mentioned rumors about his memory returning. Oscar confirmed it, which pleased the older man. Once a junior to Oscar when he was Tower Master, Maxim was now an elder at 45, honest, hard-working, and once known for trailing after Oscar, calling him Senior, with earnest respect. Noticing Oscar's faint smile, Maxim asked about it, then quickly moved on. He brought up the deaths of the Gordon family's boss and acting head. He asked if Oscar knew anything. Oscar calmly explained they had tried to kill him. The poisoned elixir and the ledger he took from their house proved it. Maxim connected the dots. The assassination attempt explained Oscar's recent condition. Oscar confirmed it, adding that he had killed the men while defending himself. The ledger included the contract details. Maxim agreed to frame it as self-defense and promised to shield Oscar from any legal fallout. With that cleared, Oscar made a request. He wanted to meet the current Tower Master, Shasha. Maxim saw no reason to deny it, especially since the two had previously spoken often. This surprised Oscar. He hadn't known that Krushin had been close to Shasha. He wondered what those conversations were about. Unfortunately, Maxim said the earliest possible meeting was 6 months away, during the White Night Festival. Shasha was away on a commission, filling in for the absent High Mage. Curious, Oscar asked her level. Maxim replied that she was a level 7. Oscar reflected on that. At her age, he had already reached level 9. Given her potential, she should have reached level 8 by now. He wondered what had slowed her down. Maxim shifted the topic, bringing up a report that mentioned how unnaturally clean the corpses had been. He asked if Oscar had resumed practicing offensive magic. Oscar replied that he trained only when he felt like it. With that, Maxim dismissed him. After Oscar left, Vice Master Hamel Glimwitz appeared. He advised Maxim not to be too harsh with Oscar, saying that he had brought the boy into the tower. Maxim acknowledged the concern but insisted that Oscar should be held accountable if he caused trouble. Still, he admitted that Oscar's progress was impressive. Mastering a windshield spell in just days wasn't something a level 2 mage should manage. It meant Oscar had been studying hard. Satisfied, Glimwitz left for the Elder's meeting with Elder Fenelina. Meanwhile, Oscar found himself back in the tower's greenhouse, the same one from his dreams. As he walked through the greenery, he encountered the caretaker, an older man who introduced himself as Walter, the tower's facility manager. Though Oscar didn't recognize him, Walter did. Walter remarked on the memory loss rumors and confirmed them after seeing Oscar in person. Oscar noticed Walter calling him, "Young Sir Oscar," and asked why. Walter explained that he had served under the previous Tower Master, Great Sir Oscar, and used the title to distinguish between the two. Oscar asked Walter to stay by his side, to be a conversation partner. Walter appreciated the sentiment but confessed he wouldn't be around much longer. After 40 years in the tower, he was planning to leave. He'd watched 3 masters come and go, survived countless transitions, and outlived his peers. The only reason he'd stayed this long was because of something the former Oscar had once said: that everyone in the tower mattered, that they should live with pride as part of it. Walter had taken those words to heart. Oscar told him that was nothing to laugh at, that he was proud of Walter's dedication. But Walter had already made up his mind. The tower was falling apart. The facilities were crumbling. Finances were worse than ever. Next month, Walter would hit 40 years and receive his long service reward, 200,000 bells, enough to buy a house. But the tower couldn't afford to pay that anymore. People would have to risk their lives on dangerous commissions just to cover it. Walter didn't want to be a burden. To him, the tower had always been home. Oscar felt a tight knot in his chest. The reality of the tower's decline hit him hard. He'd once looked down on the Azure Tower's commercial focus. Now he realized he'd been arrogant. The Azure Tower wasn't corrupt. It was smart, profitable, and successful. Meanwhile, he had titles: War Hero, Mankind's Savior. They were empty honors, useless when he couldn't even secure a reward for someone who'd served 4 decades. Walter's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Oscar glanced down and saw blood on his hand. He'd clenched his fist so hard in frustration that his nails had broken skin. He asked Walter how long he had left. 2 weeks, the caretaker said. Oscar quietly declared that he wanted to find a way to make enough money so that no one would ever have to leave the tower for financial reasons again. Walter didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Oscar had made a promise, but he had no clue how to fulfill it. Lectures and commissions wouldn't cut it. Not for funding an entire tower. Especially not as a level 2 mage. He needed something bigger. A real business, one that could change everything. Oscar was considering working with potions when something clicked in his mind, an idea sharp and sudden, like lightning in the dark. Enlightenment struck, and he knew exactly what needed to be done. Meanwhile, inside the Vice Tower Master's office, chaos simmered. Elder Fidelina was on the verge of losing it. Her fury over recent events, particularly the act of theft being brushed aside, had boiled over. Every calm response from Elder Maxim only made her angrier, especially as he downplayed the seriousness of the situation. She got in his face, shouting that he opposed every suggestion she made, no matter how small. Despite their bickering, both were senior elders, yet they fought like children. The Vice Tower Master intervened. He agreed with Maxim, saying that tossing Oscar into extreme isolation training was excessive. It would be torture, not discipline. Instead, he proposed a financial penalty, 3 times the amount Oscar had embezzled. Fidelina pushed back. The tower was bleeding money. Selling off unused potion equipment could keep them afloat for a quarter year, and that was the only reasonable move. But the Vice Master refused, saying the White Tower was sacred ground. Its future couldn't be sold to cover the present. He was right, but idealism didn't pay the bills. Fidelina, nearly at her limit, snapped. She demanded to know if they even had a future to protect. After 20 years of decay, hoping for miracles was pointless. Maxim scolded her for the cold remark. The Vice Tower Master said nothing, until the door opened, and in walked Oscar Crushin. Oscar had come with a proposition, a business plan. Fidelina was the first to react, unsurprisingly furious that the same boy who stole their funds now dared to pitch a business idea. She started ranting, but Oscar ignored her and spoke directly to the Vice Master. He brought up the recent news. Vince's estate was under lockdown due to a flu outbreak. The Vice Master suspected the Cadena flu, a dangerous illness with no existing cure. The vaccine once made by the White Tower had been destroyed 20 years ago, along with all research. Oscar revealed that even the Blue Tower hadn't replicated it. That was why he was here. He planned to recreate the vaccine and sell it, corner the market and rebuild the White Tower through a new monopoly. The room fell into silence. Fidelina scoffed at the absurdity. A 20-year-old claiming he could do what the best minds in magic had failed to do. She called him delusional. Oscar responded with a smug grin and a reminder that geniuses like him didn't follow rules, they made them. That was the final straw. Fidelina exploded, shouting that Oscar was the same selfish brat who blew their funds on an illegal elixir. She accused him of being clueless about money and responsibility. The Vice Master cut her off, saying Oscar's plan, ridiculous as it sounded, had the potential to save the White Tower. He urged her to show some respect, given the stakes. Fidelina backed down, apologizing for her harshness, though the resentment stayed in her eyes. Oscar understood. The previous Oscar Crushin had done nothing redeeming for 2 years. This reputation was earned. But Oscar Sage wasn't Crushin, and he was confident this plan would work. To confirm the outbreak was truly Cadena flu, Oscar pointed them to page 2 of the report. It detailed Archbishop Baldwin's unexpected route changes. Originally scheduled to stay in Saran for a month, he instead moved quickly through major cities, likely avoiding Vince. The El Terra Order, worshippers of Terra, had 7 archbishops bound by tradition. During pilgrimages, these archbishops visited noble estates to gather funds. Yet Saran was no longer a profitable city. It made no sense to skip Vince, unless something serious was happening there. Maxim speculated Baldwin was using prayer obligations as an excuse, but Oscar quickly dismantled that idea. The pilgrimage route was fixed: Saran, Mosque, Melbourne, Greenwale, and finally Vince. Baldwin's delays implied fear, possibly avoiding Vince due to knowledge of the flu. All 3 elders listened closely now. Oscar's conclusion was clear. Baldwin suspected the outbreak and was stalling. If an accident occurred in Vince, the El Terra Order would blame divine punishment, and Baldwin's chances of rising to cardinal status would be ruined. Maxim agreed. It made sense. Fidelina, despite herself, admitted Oscar's analysis was sharp. The Vice Master was impressed but explained they couldn't support him with tower funds. They had too many mages to look after. Still, believing in the idea, he offered Oscar 30,000 bells from his own pocket, a personal investment. Oscar went pale. That amount wasn't nearly enough, but he thanked him anyway. In the production chamber, Oscar nursed a headache. Plan B it was. He'd make a sample of the vaccine, sell it to Baldwin, and get funding from the church side instead. If Baldwin's status was on the line, he'd pay anything. Oscar rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The test run, a simple energy drink, had gone well. Frank had gathered the premium ingredients, and Oscar was impressed. He joked that Frank should become a merchant. Turns out, that's Frank's backup plan once the tower goes under. Oscar flicked his forehead for speaking ill of the tower. Though Elder Fidelina had assigned Frank to assist, Oscar was beginning to see another side of her. Maybe she wasn't as heartless as she seemed. Still, Oscar didn't need help. He just needed people to stop causing problems and start contributing. But Frank, despite being young, seemed sharp. Oscar had a question for him. Frank had noticed the ingredients Oscar requested were all toxic: black lilies, ghost mushrooms, red camellias. He expressed concern. Oscar explained that even poisonous herbs could be used medicinally, if processed correctly. First, they'd be detoxified by boiling for 12 hours. But that posed another problem. It also stripped out the nutrients. Oscar asked Frank if he knew about dumplings from the Yen dynasty. Frank nodded, and Oscar explained that the steamer used for making them could also detoxify herbs while preserving their nutrients. That was the plan. To extract about 98% of the ingredient's essence using steam, bringing their monopoly on the cure one step closer to reality. Frank asked if steaming finished the detox process, but Oscar clarified it didn't. The herbs only softened. The real detoxification happened with a spell called air drain, which pulled the poisonous steam out, leaving nothing but pure vapor. After that, the components were recombined into a single potion. And just like that, the impossible cure for the Kadena flu was complete. Frank was speechless. Oscar encouraged him to try it, but Frank admitted he didn't even know how to dual cast. Still, he gave it a shot. His mana control was shaky, but better than Oscar expected. When he hit his limit, Oscar teased him for struggling. Frank protested. He wasn't even level 4 yet. Oscar smirked and offered to teach him the secret. He explained that dual casting required splitting focus. One hemisphere of the brain on spell A, the other on spell B. Frank tried again, and this time, he succeeded. He was surprised it came so easily. Oscar explained that it was kept a secret technique, not because it was hard, but because senior mages hoarded knowledge. They wanted juniors to earn it, which in a real-world power struggle was a wasteful tradition. Oscar was glad to finally be pushing change. Frank's raw talent and quick grasp of magic impressed him. The kid was excited, eager to fetch more herbs. They moved on to the big steamer, scaling up the process. Hours passed, and Frank worked himself to the bone. Knees buckling, sweat dripping, he collapsed. But together, they produced over 500 bottles of vaccine. That's when Elder Maxim stormed in, holding a note in his trembling hands. The Blue Tower had arranged a meeting with Archbishop Baldwin, through their pharmaceutical company. Maxim feared they'd been outpaced. Oscar immediately understood the danger. If the Blue Tower secured a deal first, their shot at a monopoly would be over. Frank, devastated, was consoled by Maxim, but Oscar wasn't ready to quit. He reminded them that the Kadena flu was a B-rank disaster, and there was still one more play left. He suggested Maxim deliver the sample himself. His personal flight speed was faster than any travel wagon. The scene shifted to Archbishop Baldwin's residence, where the Blue Tower's envoys, Level 5 Mage Moira Meehan and Director Neil Bryan, had arrived. Baldwin welcomed them and asked about the cure. Moira cheerfully reported that progress was steady, but clinical trials still needed months. Full release would take at least half a year. That didn't sit well with Baldwin, whose pilgrimage to Vince was scheduled in just 4 months. His plans were at risk. Then, a knock. Another guest. A young, black-haired mage stepped inside and politely introduced himself as Oscar Crushen of the White Tower. He promised a better offer. Moira's face twisted at the name. Baldwin was surprised. He hadn't expected anyone from the White Tower. Oscar stated that he was there to speak about the Kadena flu. Baldwin explained that Moira and Neil were already handling it. Oscar asked if he was too late, but Baldwin's irritation with the Blue Tower's timeline gave him a chance. The Archbishop was desperate, and Oscar was offering immediate results. Moira lashed out, calling Oscar a liar. She said the White Tower lacked the funds, equipment, and knowledge to pull off such a feat. Baldwin asked for Oscar's name again and whether he truly had a cure. In response, Oscar calmly placed a small wooden box on the table and opened it. Inside was a potion, its liquid shimmering blue. Moira froze. Baldwin leaned in, impressed, and asked how many units could be produced and how soon. Moira tried to object, but Baldwin silenced him, fed up with their empty promises. Moira pointed out that the White Tower, like them, didn't have official approval to sell medicine. Oscar agreed. But when Moira tried to use that as leverage, boasting of the Blue Tower's track record and their factory-scale production capabilities, Oscar cut him off. With a smirk, he reminded Moira of history. The White Tower, the first magic tower ever established, had monopolized the Kadena flu cure 2 decades ago. Moira dismissed the past as irrelevant, but Oscar wasn't done. He let his mana pressure bleed out into the room, and it weighed heavily despite him being only level 2. It shook Moira. This shouldn't be possible. Before the tension could rise further, a servant rushed in with a message. Baldwin had an urgent call, from the Lord of Vince. Baldwin answered and was stunned. The Lord thanked him profusely for sending the cure. Baldwin was confused. He hadn't sent anything. The Lord explained that a White Tower elder, claiming to act under Baldwin's request, had already delivered the vaccine, and it was working wonders. Patients were recovering within hours. It felt like divine intervention. Baldwin, stunned and elated, turned to Oscar. Oscar just stood there, calmly enjoying their shocked expressions. Moira's face turned a deeper shade of horror with every word from the other end of the call. No side effects. Rapid results. The Lord of Vince even asked for a second shipment. Baldwin, now fully convinced, took charge and assured the Lord they'd send more immediately. Then he turned to Oscar, eyes wide with admiration, and asked if he was the one behind it all. Moira exploded, furious that Oscar's actions violated pharmaceutical law, but Oscar silenced him with a sharp reminder. He'd already schooled the man on history. Now it was time to educate him on war legislation. Moira scoffed, thinking Oscar was dodging the topic. But Oscar questioned if 2 decades of peace had made people forget what crisis looks like. He laid it out plainly. 22 years ago, it wasn't weapons that nearly ended humanity. It was a plague. The pandemic decimated human forces during the Demon War. In response, mages rushed to create cures, but the FDA's slow response led to countless deaths. That failure led to a change in the law, declaring that in wartime or crisis, certain medical treatments would be exempt from FDA approval. Moira argued that they weren't at war, so the exemption was irrelevant. Oscar disagreed. He listed the 3 conditions that qualified: conflict between nations, internal rebellion, or the spread of a disaster classified threat ranked B or higher. The Kadena flu was rank B, case closed. Moira was stunned. The pharmaceutical director tried to pivot, claiming they could now rush their own product to market. But Baldwin dismissed it. The White Tower had already acted, and more importantly, the Lord of Vince now believed Baldwin himself had ordered the cure. That political illusion couldn't be undone. Desperate, the director begged to negotiate prices. Baldwin slammed his fist on the chair, snapping that reputation couldn't be bought. He was done with them. Moira, seething, promised revenge and stormed out. Though Oscar found the threat laughable, mocking him for his melodramatic exit. He even joked that Moira must have rehearsed the line like a 2-bit villain. Adding salt to the wound, Oscar casually revealed he'd already registered a patent on the vaccine. If the Blue Tower wanted to sell anything, they'd need to pay royalties to the White Tower. Moira looked like he might burst into flames on the spot. As the 2 defeated men exited, Oscar caught a whiff of a familiar scent, the same clear mint smell he was warned about. The Blue Tower's director was one of the men behind the poisoned elixir. But now wasn't the time to deal with that. Baldwin invited Oscar to sit. He was impressed but wanted to talk business. He revealed that the Blue Tower had asked for 2 million bells. Oscar, without flinching, asked for 5. The Archbishop nearly choked. A few hours later, back in the Vice Tower Master's office, Ferdinand stared at the check in her hand. 10 million bells. Oscar confirmed it was real, and both elders tackled him with praise. Even Hamill was stunned. He asked how Baldwin agreed to the price. Oscar explained he'd added a marketing fee on top. In exchange, the White Tower would announce that Baldwin had foreseen the outbreak through divine revelation and preemptively requested the vaccine. Perfect fuel for the Archbishop's bid to become a cardinal. That divine image was worth far more than money to a man like Baldwin. So, he paid 10 million up front for the exclusive contract. Oscar promised to deliver the vaccines within a week. That more than satisfied the elders. The original punishment for embezzling funds was 3 times the amount stolen. Oscar had delivered 400 times that. Case closed. Hamill turned to Ferdinand, asking if she had any objections. She smiled and gave a thumbs up, none at all. The deadline was tight, though. Hamill told Oscar to request whatever support he needed. Oscar said they needed every level 4 mage and up, immediately. Hamel agreed and asked Oscar to handle the volunteers himself. Lena, now fully cooperative, offered to make the announcement, but admitted she wasn't sure how to word it. Hamel kept it simple. Call for level 4 mages or higher to the lab, and offer a side of meat with every meal. Soon, the production lab was filled with mages, drawn by the announcement. Their main concern: what kind of meat they'd be getting. Rumors spread like wildfire. Oscar arrived with Frank, who was stunned to see the lab so full. Just yesterday, no one would have stepped near this place. Oscar clapped his hands for attention, but was ignored. The room was too loud, the chatter too thick. So, he snapped his fingers and unleashed a soundbind spell. An ear-shattering noise that stopped everyone cold. Silence finally claimed the space. Oscar got to the point. They were there to help produce vaccines and antidotes for the Kadena flu, and he needed their assistance. The response wasn't kind. The mages mocked him. The so-called genius asking for help? Must be a scam. Many doubted he could create a cure at all. Oscar stood there, dumbfounded by the hostility. He turned to Frank and asked what the hell was wrong with everyone. Why did they all seem to hate him? Frank, expecting skepticism from the crowd, bluntly told Oscar that, until now, he'd been nothing but a nuisance. Arrogant, irresponsible, a drunk who wasted resources and contributed nothing. Just dead weight on the White Tower. Hearing it laid out so plainly made Oscar pause. Was he really that terrible? Still, he believed the previous Oscar had done his best with what he had. Just then, a sharp voice cut through the tension. A young blonde mage raised her hand, Lena White. She questioned how Oscar planned to produce vaccines and antidotes when the White Tower's production methods had been lost. Oscar calmly said he'd recovered them. She asked if their effectiveness had been proven, and he confirmed that they had. He even had a contract with the Order. That raised a bigger concern. If the production method leaked, the real reward, those precious meat side dishes, would be meaningless. So why trust them with it? Oscar admitted he didn't know, but he suspected it was the same reason they all remained in the crumbling White Tower. Despite the offers, despite the decline, something deeper kept them here. Lena narrowed her eyes, offended by his tone. She said if this was how he asked for help, then she'd wasted her time. But Oscar pressed on. He named her age, level, and history. Lena White, 25, level 5 mage, had turned down offers from 7 major corporations, including the Red Tower. He listed the others. Herrick Dryan, offered a royal mage position. Descartes Rain, who refused a post as academy instructor 4 times. Sophia Rose, courted by the Golden Tower for her alchemy genius, all had stayed. He admitted he didn't know if he could have turned down such opportunities, but they had. That loyalty, he said, was reason enough to trust them. Lena frowned, realizing the elders had known of their recruitment offers all along but stayed silent. Oscar confirmed it. They didn't want to burden anyone with guilt. The White Tower was facing its coldest winter. Still, they had all chosen to remain. If he couldn't trust people like that, who could he? Then, with a dramatic shift, Oscar wiped away fake tears, claiming that if none of them wanted to help, he and Frank would do all the work alone. Frank, annoyed, asked if Oscar was dragging him into that declaration. Oscar, in mock despair, told him to hurry up then. Oscar pulled on his goggles and resumed his performance, bringing the room to a quiet halt. Lena sighed and stepped forward, grabbing a pair of goggles. That single act broke the tension. Soon, everyone followed her lead. Frank slipped his on and asked if he was dreaming. Oscar said that dreams like this weren't bad. Then he revealed the truth. The meat side dish wasn't pork, chicken, or rats, it was beef. The crowd erupted. Some even cried. By the end of the week, they surpassed expectations, producing 140% of the goal. Oscar returned to the greenhouse, where a red petal in the shape of a heart drifted by. He figured Walter must be back, probably dragged back by the Vice Tower Master. He made a mental note to talk to him later, then opened a newspaper. Vin's territory had declared the end of the Kadena flu, just 2 days after distribution. The White Tower's comeback had begun. Oscar Crushen was now a Peace Award nominee. Publicly, all credit went to the Archbishop, boosting his popularity, but behind the scenes, Oscar had orchestrated everything. Frank soon arrived, list in hand, beaming. The antidotes were a hit. Orders were flooding in from the northern territories, the Order, even the Imperial family. The White Tower was rising again. Oscar set the paper down and read the list. For now, the fire had been contained. But Frank, ever sharp, pointed out that the demand would fade once the flu passed. Oscar was impressed the kid saw it coming. Frank said anyone with a brain could predict that people wouldn't buy a flu cure when the flu was gone. The next outbreak wouldn't happen for decades. Oscar reassured him. He had another potion ready, one that would always be in demand. Frank's eyes lit up. Was it the legendary Star Tears potion? Oscar shook his finger. Not yet. That one could resurrect the nearly dead. If released too soon, it would attract greedy vultures who'd stop at nothing to steal it. For now, they'd sell low and mid-tier potions to build strength. Star Tears would come later, after they secured their power. Frank groaned when Oscar assigned him the task of gathering ingredients. He immediately regretted getting excited. When he saw the list, he froze. Some ingredients were impossible to get. Oscar was confused. Weren't they Sarin specialties? Frank explained that those herbs hadn't been produced in years. The farms were gone. Later, Frank's curses echoed through the woods. Oscar insisted they walk the last stretch to their destination, saying the carriage couldn't go further. Frank grumbled and asked if it was really necessary. Oscar told him they'd already walked over 10 miles. Frank snapped, asking why Oscar was using a unit no longer in use. Oscar was stunned. Miles were outdated. Frank informed him everything had switched to metric since the war. Pounds were gone too. Oscar was horrified. The old units had been fun. He offered a moment of silence for miles and pounds, mourning their extinction. Just then, Frank spotted a hut in the distance. They knocked, and an elderly man cracked open the door, surprised they'd come on foot. Before anything else could be said, 3 cars barreled down the narrow path, tearing through the garden. They skidded to a stop in front of the hut. A short, smug man stepped out of the middle car and pointed at the old man. He asked if today was finally the day he was ready to sell his land. An old man flung his door open and stepped outside just as a man stormed toward him, shouting in frustration that it was time to stop being so stubborn. The man declared he'd pay 10 times the usual price for the land. Nearby, Oscar and Frank watched with confused expressions. Frank leaned over to Oscar and asked what was going on. Oscar admitted he had no clue. The old man stood firm, arms crossed, and responded defiantly that he wouldn't sell, not even for the Grand Miss Rello Castle. The man, now smirking, warned that playing hard to get was fun at first, but if the old man died alone, no one would even remember him. The man revealed himself as Devor Paywall, a businessman. The old man, herbalist Ivan, snapped that it was none of Devor's business. Devor kept a friendly facade and said he only cared about Ivan's well-being. He advised Ivan to sell and enjoy a comfortable life, warning that factories would eventually surround his land and destroy its value. Ivan, unbothered, replied with a calm smile that he would never allow a factory to rise while he still breathed. He made it clear that he would defend his land at all costs. Devor glared, then turned to his guards and ordered them to leave. One guard nodded and opened the car door. As Devor climbed in, he looked back at Ivan with a mocking grin and said he had crushed some herbs on the way. He tossed a pack of money toward Ivan and claimed it was payment for the damage. Once inside the car, Devor waved dismissively. As they drove away, he asked his guard if the 2 men beside Ivan had been wearing White Tower robes. The guard guessed they came for herbs and mentioned the White Tower had recently profited from a vaccine. Devor, now intrigued, demanded to know how much. The guard handed him a newspaper and said it was a lot. After reading, Devor exploded in anger, hit the guard with the paper, and berated him for withholding important information. Devor feared that if Ivan gained the White Tower's support, he could resist for years. With loans piling up, Devor couldn't risk that. He asked the guard if they still had contact with the mercenaries. When the guard asked what kind of job, Devor laughed coldly and said they'd make Ivan disappear. The guard hesitated, pointing out Ivan's status, but Devor struck him again and said no one would care if Ivan vanished. With no owner, the land would be auctioned. The guard warned that interference from the 4 magic towers would be disastrous, and Ivan wasn't some weak old man. But Devor dismissed the concern, saying the White Tower was already crumbling and the others were irrelevant. He remained confident. That night, Frank lay on the grass, gazing at the moon. He said Ivan seemed like a good man. He let them stay and even fed them. Oscar smiled and agreed. Earlier, as they approached Ivan's hut, Ivan had asked their names and said they should stay the night. Frank asked if that was really okay. Ivan replied with pride that his loyalty to the White Tower remained strong. Oscar quietly wondered what that loyalty meant. Frank had asked about the man from earlier, noting he'd arrived by car. Ivan, exhausted, answered that it was a madman named Devor Paywall, capable of kidnapping and murder for his goals. Ivan said Devor had bought every piece of land but many herbalists had fled or vanished. Frank asked why Devor wanted the land. Ivan said Devor wanted to turn it into the continent's largest factory zone. Oscar asked how Ivan had held out. Ivan proudly said Devor couldn't touch him because he was a human cultural asset in herb cultivation. Frank asked if that meant protection from the imperial family. Ivan confirmed it. Oscar wondered why Ivan didn't just sell and become rich. Ivan, smiling warmly, said he loved his land. It was his home from birth and would be till his death. Later that night, Oscar and Frank lay under the stars. Oscar said Ivan was truly good. Frank recalled how Ivan had turned shy after boasting. He admired the stars and admitted he envied Ivan's peaceful life. Oscar asked what exactly he was jealous of. Frank said he wished he knew what it felt like to live a bright, fulfilling life, and added that Oscar, being a genius, wouldn't understand. Oscar looked away, embarrassed, and told Frank he was impressive too. Frank blushed and thanked him, joking that even if it was flattery, he appreciated it. But Oscar insisted he didn't give praise lightly. Inwardly, he wondered why his younger self had ever called Frank a problem. Frank pointed to the stars and said they were beautiful. Oscar agreed and reminisced about when stars could be seen even in Serene City. Now, streetlights made the sky too bright. He missed the romantic darkness of the past. Frank teased him, asking how he remembered that, being younger. Then he asked if they could really revive Serene's herb industry. Oscar said it wasn't impossible, but they'd need to talk with Ivan. Suddenly, Oscar tensed, eyes sharp. He said there were 4 people approaching. Frank, confused, saw nothing. Oscar realized it was high-level stealth. Frank couldn't detect them either. Oscar stood and told Frank to get ready. Meanwhile, 2 figures ran through the woods. The boy mocked that Devor had turned down their offer to kill Ivan, calling him a coward. The old man said it didn't matter. They did as paid. The boy bragged about their notoriety and teased the old man for being too calm. Suddenly, their leader, Gun, barked an order to stay sharp. There might be a mage nearby. The old man said if it was the White Tower, it would be easier than facing the others. The boy hoped a mage would show, eager for a fight. He stepped into the hut, spinning a key in his fingers, thinking it was too easy. But as he neared the bed, he felt something behind him. He turned and saw Oscar, energy swirling in his fist. Oscar called him quick-witted but useless, then fired a wind bullet straight through his head, killing him instantly. Part sat up from under the blanket and commented that wind bullet was a useful spell. A technique Oscar had created to mimic a gunshot using wind magic. Oscar stepped outside, expecting 3 more enemies, but found only 2. The gang leader clenched his fist and asked what Oscar had done to Max. Oscar said Max was sleeping inside, possibly forever. The old man cursed Max for letting his guard down. The leader offered to let Max's death slide if Oscar gave up Ivan's location. Oscar refused, saying they could go ahead and hold their grudge. The leader ordered the old man to attack. Oscar blocked with a windshield but had to dodge as the shield cracked. The old man laughed mockingly. Oscar smiled back and called it impressive. The old man wielded a rare, unique weapon and claimed the fight was over. Oscar remained unfazed and launched magic balls that shattered the weapon. He said it wasn't impressive to him. Furious, the old man yelled, but bullets suddenly rained down on Oscar. His shield held, but one bullet cut his cheek. Jack shot the old man in the head and grinned, saying he'd been a replaceable subordinate. Oscar, serious and bleeding, asked what kind of tool Jack used. Jack called it expensive, not just a tool. Oscar identified the spells: acceleration, enhancement, penetration. Jack asked how he knew. Oscar said the bullet's force proved it was magical. Jack praised Oscar's talent and offered him a job. Oscar declined, saying he couldn't trust someone like Jack. Jack agreed with a laugh. Oscar later lay behind a wooden shield, thinking bitterly about hiding like this. He knew Jack's weakness. Reloading took 1.4 seconds. He planned to finish it in 1.24. When Jack mocked him, Oscar activated Accelerate and dashed forward, shielded. Jack fired but the bullet slid off. Oscar advanced, forming a new magic ball. Jack panicked, realizing Oscar had enchanted his shield. Oscar pressed the ball to Jack's forehead and killed him. Oscar picked up Jack's gun and admired it. Trinity, a weapon with 3 spells. He reflected on how his dual enchanted shield had saved him. The bullet slid off, not pierced through. That's how he survived. Oscar understood with chilling clarity that if his shield had failed, he would be the one dead. The near miss jolted him. He knew he had to study how to counter guns with magic once he returned to the White Tower. His current body was incomplete, and the repeated magic use had drained him nearly dry. But first, he had to find Frank and Ivan. He recalled sensing 4 enemies. 3 were down. 1 remained. He hoped Frank hadn't been caught and forced himself to keep moving. Meanwhile, Frank and Ivan stood together, facing a menacing man. Frank told Ivan to run. When Ivan hesitated, Frank reassured him that he was strong enough and needed space to fight. Ivan placed a trusting hand on Frank's shoulder, urged caution, and left. The enemy mocked Frank's sentimental farewell and questioned whether he thought sacrificing himself would save Ivan. He revealed that Ivan was his real target but admitted he was curious about the power of mages from the Great Towers. With that, he lunged at Frank. Frank responded with Windcutter. The man attacked again, taunting that this was too easy, and drove his sword into Frank's chest. Frank's eyes widened in shock. The man jeered at the supposed strength of the tower mages. But then confusion crossed his face. Something felt wrong. The sensation wasn't right. Too light. As the man processed the mistake, Frank seized the sword and slashed his throat with a knife. Blood poured as the man dropped, choking and screaming. Frank stood over him, serious and composed, even with a hole in his chest. He explained that his body wasn't like others. As the man's head hit the ground, Frank flinched, barely avoiding stepping on it. Oscar emerged from behind a tree, holding a gun and staring at Frank with realization. He now understood. Frank hadn't just used magic. He had received the blessing of the god of wind. Parts of Frank's body could literally become wind, nullifying physical attacks. Oscar recalled that such a power was once possessed by the 7th Tower Master, recorded only in ancient texts. Oscar approached and called Frank's name. Frank jumped and caught his breath, startled. He asked when Oscar had arrived. Oscar answered calmly that he had just gone there and praised Frank's performance. Frank, flustered and joyful, asked him to say more. But Oscar shifted gears, asking where Ivan was. Frank's face turned guilty as he called out for Ivan. Oscar sensed Ivan's energy nearby and pointed in the direction. Frank followed, now silent and focused. The next morning, sunlight bathed the hut. Inside, Ivan hugged Frank with deep gratitude, saying he wouldn't have survived without him. Frank deflected the praise, pointing to Oscar, but Oscar corrected him. He admitted he had missed one of the attackers and repeated twice that Frank's actions had been crucial. Ivan placed his hands on Frank's shoulders. Frank, overwhelmed, awkwardly tried to change the subject. Ivan replied that their enemy wouldn't give up and would find another way. They gathered around the table. Frank asked why the man, Paywall or Tall, was so obsessed with the land. Ivan explained that this land was the best in Sauron, fertile, vast, and perfectly located. But the region's fertility had declined over 8 years due to polluted runoff from magical engineering factories in the west. If factories were built here, the land would eventually die. Oscar, thoughtful, asked Ivan about his loyalty to the White Tower. Was it tied to a promise made by Reynold Ayus, the 4th Tower Master? Ivan was surprised and asked how Oscar knew. Frank looked lost. Oscar recounted the forgotten history of herbalists, once outcasts, distrusted, called witches. They wandered, never welcome. Then Reynold Ayus appeared. He saw their value and offered them a permanent home in Cyrene, promising safety and dignity for generations. Ivan smiled, touched. He admitted it was the first time he had heard Reynold's actual words. Oscar said he had read them in a storybook, though privately he knew the truth. It was from a secret tome for Tower Masters only. Ivan continued, explaining how herbalists had gathered in Cyrene, finally finding peace. Frank started to ask about the White Tower, but Ivan cut in emotionally, saying the White Tower gave his ancestors pride and belonging. He could never abandon it. Oscar rose and bowed. He thanked Ivan for all his years of dedication and vowed that the White Tower would now protect him. Ivan was stunned, suspecting there was already a plan in place. He asked how it would work. Frank added that the imperial family would act if they knew someone had harmed a cultural treasure. Oscar was internally annoyed, wishing the emotional moment hadn't been undercut. Ivan warned that the imperial family's help might come too late due to their slow, precise nature. He couldn't leave to ask for help, and if a full assault came, the delay could be fatal. Oscar interrupted with a confident smile. He said the imperial family would move faster than light. Ivan questioned how. Oscar revealed he would sign a contract with them that very day. The scene shifted to Devor Paywall's office. He raged at his guard, blaming him for a mistake that might ruin him. Then came footsteps. Devor turned, stunned, as armed security officers entered. The lead officer, calm and authoritative, introduced himself as Senior Superintendent Walker of the Bureau of National Security. Devor asked why such a high-ranking figure had come. Walker ignored him and issued an arrest warrant for attempted murder, blackmail, illegal land grabs, and damaging a cultural property. Devor stammered in denial, calling himself a decent businessman. Walker cut him off and ordered the arrest. A guard obeyed instantly. Devor, desperate, claimed he had powerful backing, even the emperor. But no one listened. A security man took his cigar and cuffed him. Walker took a puff and remarked coldly that at least Devor had good taste. Both Devor and his guard were arrested. The guard begged, but it made no difference. As they were taken away, a young officer asked why the operation had moved so fast. Walker replied that the order came from above. The officer repeated the phrase, puzzled. Walker nodded. He added that the emperor loved the White Tower. When asked to explain, Walker called it a matter between adults. Internally, he reflected on how the tower had once been powerful, heroes of the war against demons 20 years ago. Those memories still shaped decisions. He told the officer, Dolan, that he was only 3 years old back then, while Walker had been 12. He recalled how the tower had been a symbol of hope. While it had faded since, the loyalty to it remained among the elite. He put out the cigar and gave a final order. They had one more stop. Dolan was surprised, thinking they were done. But Walker confirmed they weren't finished yet. As they walked, Dolan asked where they were headed next. Walker informed the security team to wrap things up and head home, then told Dolan they were going west to deal with illegal factories near the Balf River. Though not on the official schedule, Walker had added this stop himself. His way of repaying Oscar Crushen and Frank Sirius for eliminating the threat of Jack Gang. Dolan, tired and hungry, asked if they could grab food. Walker declined, saying work came first. Dolan knew better than to argue. Meanwhile, at the White Tower, Frank and Oscar stood in the garden. Frank threw up his hands in relief, saying it was finally over. Oscar smiled, praised his efforts, and said he was off to report to the Vice Tower Master. Frank suggested drinks, but before the conversation continued, an elderly man named Hamill called their names. Frank quickly claimed he had plans and dashed off, leaving Oscar puzzled. Hamill reached Oscar, asked if that was really Frank, and joked about his urgency. Then he commended Oscar, reminding him he'd only sent him out for fresh air, not to resolve a national incident. He invited Oscar to his office for a full debrief. Once inside, Hamill fell silent. Oscar sensed something was wrong. When Hamill finally spoke, he asked if Oscar had heard anything from Frank. Oscar replied no and asked if something had happened. Hamill explained that the Sirius family intended to take Frank back. They claimed the decision had already been discussed with him. Oscar clenched his fists in disbelief. He asked if Frank had agreed. Hamill wasn't sure. Frank, meanwhile, was in his room, quietly packing. Oscar barged in, demanding to know if Frank was really the youngest son of the Empire's largest trading company. Frank admitted it, calling Oscar a fool for eavesdropping. Oscar asked if he was truly leaving. Frank confessed he couldn't say it sober, which was why he'd suggested drinks earlier. He explained that he had duties at the family company and an upcoming arranged marriage. Oscar, surprised by the marriage, asked when it had started. Frank calmly explained that the woman came from a good family and seemed nice. It made sense for the business. Oscar sensed this was more obligation than affection and asked if Frank was really okay with it. Frank insisted he was fine, though his tone lacked conviction. Then Oscar asked the real question. Was Frank giving up magic? Frank admitted he'd once thought he could stand out by joining the weakest tower. He had hoped to be the head of the snake. But reality hit him hard. He felt guilty saying this in front of Oscar, who truly loved the White Tower. Frank explained that he hadn't made a real place for himself in the tower, and his family's call made sense. His tone was heavy with disappointment. Oscar called his name in disbelief. Frank tried to deflect with a joke, but Oscar looked him straight in the eye and said he was talented. Frank blushed and muttered a shy thanks, surprised by the compliment. Oscar then made an offer. What if Frank really did become the head of the snake? Suddenly, a boy entered the room and called out to Frank. It was his brother, Frank, who asked if Oscar was a colleague. Without waiting, he told Frank he had 5 minutes to finish up. As he turned to leave, Oscar boldly asked how much it would cost for Frank to stay. Frank turned, demanding to know who Oscar thought he was. Oscar gripped the door and introduced himself. Grank paused, asked if Oscar was the one who made the medicine, and when Oscar confirmed, introduced himself as Grank Sirius, eldest son of the Sirius family and vice leader of the trading company. Oscar proposed a deal. Let Frank stay. Frank panicked, shouting Oscar's name. Grank called Oscar impudent, saying he couldn't believe a child would try to negotiate with the Sirius family. Oscar, unfazed, claimed the deal wouldn't be a loss. He promised to turn Frank into one of the White Tower's top mages within 2 years. Frank stared in shock, asking if Oscar meant him. Oscar told Grank it would benefit the family long-term. Grank, intrigued, asked what the penalty would be if Oscar failed. Oscar pledged all profits from Cadena flu treatments to the Sirius company. Frank shouted in disbelief. Grank asked if Oscar had the authority to make such a deal. Oscar explained the Vice Tower Master would serve as a notary. Grank asked if this was about friendship or talent. Oscar said it was about Frank's worth. Frank was stunned. Oscar continued. He planned to restore the White Tower's former glory in 5 years. The medicine was just the beginning. He needed Frank to help build that future. Grank, impressed but cautious, agreed, on one condition. Oscar had to prove himself. He would fight one of Grank's knights, a level 5, the next day. If Oscar won, the deal was on. Oscar objected, saying he was only a level 2. Grank allowed a handicap, no sword kai. Oscar realized this was a real test. The arranged marriage must have been politically important. As Grank left, he warned that if Oscar didn't show, the deal was off. Frank, panicked, asked what Oscar planned to do. He offered to cancel the deal. But Oscar said calmly that it might be possible to win. Frank reminded him of the power difference. Oscar agreed. It would take a level 4 mage to win. Frank asked if Oscar planned to reach level 4 overnight. Oscar laughed. It wasn't him. It would be Frank. Frank looked confused. Oscar clarified. Grank never said he had to fight, only that he had to prove himself. And that, he could do by training Frank. They went to the 40th floor training room. Frank, nervous, said he had tried for years. Oscar told him to trust him. Oscar began with the basics. Stand naturally, close your eyes, feel the mana. Frank's body began to glow. Oscar explained posture and mana flow, pointing out energy leaks weakening Frank's magic. Only Oscar could see these, he said, not even other geniuses. Frank grumbled, asking if fixing them would raise his level. Oscar said no, not directly. Most mages ignored them. But the top 0.1%, the archmages, paid attention. Oscar told Frank to practice daily and explain specific circuits. He pointed out areas with fast mana flow causing scatter, and slow zones needing acceleration. One had 6 entry points. Split mana equally there to improve efficiency. Frank felt overwhelmed and frustrated. Oscar reassured him it would become second nature with practice. Frank asked if that was all. Oscar said no. He wanted to see the wind magic Frank had used earlier. Frank hesitated. Oscar reminded him to trust. Frank refused, not from distrust, but fear. Frank shared a painful memory. Years ago, desperate to stand out, he tried to turn his entire body into wind. At first, it worked. But soon, it spiraled out of control. His body vanished piece by piece. He couldn't stop it. He had screamed for help as his soul felt like it was breaking into fragments. He would have died, or ceased to exist, if the Tower Master hadn't appeared. He gripped his trembling arm and said he never wanted to feel that pain again. Oscar gently reminded him he had used the spell on the hill. Frank said it activated on its own during danger. He felt ashamed, calling himself pathetic. Oscar told Frank not to call himself pathetic, assuring him that struggling with mana control was common. Frank asked if that was true, and Oscar confirmed it was. He said Frank's issue wasn't the magic itself, but how he controlled mana, and that could be fixed. Though skeptical, Frank pointed out that mana control was largely natural talent. Oscar agreed, but added that there were ways to improve it forcefully. As he spoke, he began drawing a summoning circle. Frank, curious and uneasy, asked what he was doing and if this involved demons. Oscar laughed off the suggestion, saying demons don't show up even if summoned. He explained that he was summoning a wind spirit, not for himself, but to transplant it into Frank. Soon, Frank stood at the center of the circle, invoking the wind spirit with a formal chant. He called it the Purifier of Darkness and asked it to answer the ancient pact. But nothing happened. Frank looked confused. Oscar said bluntly that Frank's affinity with spirits was awful. Frank insisted he felt a breeze, But Oscar replied it was just his own sigh. Trying to lift Frank's spirits, he said most humans had no affinity with spirits, so Frank wasn't alone. Frank asked if that meant he was doomed to fail. Oscar stayed calm. Inwardly, he recalled a ritual he'd learned among the elves in a past life. He remembered how they encouraged him to try spirit summoning, and how it had worked unexpectedly well. They'd even said he was the first human summoner in 118 years. When Frank asked if he should try again, Oscar told him to step aside. He entered the circle, thinking the Spirit King would remember him. He closed his eyes and visualized the world tree where he first succeeded. Then he called out to the wind spirit. Wind erupted through the room. Frank shielded himself and shouted in awe. The summoning had worked. A towering, elder-like spirit appeared, arms crossed, asking if a human had truly summoned him. He said it had been 27 years since he was last called. Oscar realized that had been him, in his previous life. Oscar said he wanted a contract and asked if a formal agreement was needed. The spirit introduced himself as Celestine, the highest-ranking spirit, and said no contract was necessary, just a bond of friendship. But Oscar said no. Both Celestine and Frank were stunned. Oscar explained that he had summoned Celestine not for himself, but for Frank. Frank was speechless. The next day, under the bright sun, the duel began. Frank greeted Vice Tower Master Hamill and asked if he'd accepted the deal. Hamill confirmed it, saying Oscar's stubbornness convinced him. Oscar stood confidently. Frank introduced the knight, Leslie Morgan, level 5. Oscar introduced himself as a level 2 mage. Frank explained the duel rules. Take the opponent's necklace to win. If no winner in 5 minutes, it's a loss. Oscar accepted. Frank questioned Oscar's loose outfit. Oscar smiled and said he wasn't fighting. Footsteps echoed. Frank entered, ready and focused. Frank demanded an explanation. Oscar said Frank never specified who had to fight. He had trained Frank and believed a level 4 mage had a better chance than a level 2. Frank, stunned, asked how Frank had advanced in one day. Oscar slung an arm over Frank and said if he promised to make Frank a top mage in 2 years, this was just the beginning. Frank warned they wouldn't go easy. Oscar told Frank to trust his training, he'd win. Frank nodded, determined. He greeted Leslie with respect. Frank raised his hand, signaling the start. Frank assessed the distance, 20 meters. Leslie drew his sword. Even without moving, his presence was overwhelming. Frank froze, considering surrender. But then he saw Oscar watching him, calm, supportive. Oscar's belief grounded him. Frank remembered Oscar's words. The new White Tower needed him. For the first time, he felt needed. With renewed determination, Frank summoned his magic. He called out Windblade. A shimmering blade of air formed in his hand. Eyes fixed on his opponent, Frank told himself he would not let Oscar down. Not now. Frank's wind-forged blade clashed repeatedly against Leslie, slicing the air with relentless force. Yet Leslie didn't budge. Though steady, he was surprised. Frank had grown far stronger. Leslie noted Frank's dual casting and how his attacks disrupted rhythm. It wasn't just magic. Frank had mimicked an elite sword technique from the Eastern nation, where masters fought without touching their swords, using pure energy. Frank had translated that into magic. Leslie responded, breaking Frank's wind blade with a clean strike. He'd seen enough. He dashed forward with blinding speed, aiming a blow straight at Frank. Caught off guard, Frank barely managed to summon a giant wind-formed hand to block. Leslie's assault crashed into the shield, slicing through it. Meanwhile, on the upper floor, Frank watched in disbelief. He asked how Frank had advanced so rapidly and accused Oscar of using forbidden methods. Oscar replied casually that it was all proper. Frank admitted he wasn't concerned for Frank's safety, just suspicious of how such growth was possible. Leslie's attacks intensified. Though impressed by Frank's leap in skill, he believed the young mage had reached his limit. As he closed in, he prepared to end the match. Frank covered up, bracing for impact. In Leslie's mind, Frank wasn't suited for combat. He saw a mage who, if pushed further, might welcome injury over failure. Leslie believed Frank belonged in a safe, quiet life away from battle. Watching from above, Oscar announced calmly that the fight was already over. Frank turned, startled by Oscar's smile. Why was he so confident when Frank seemed cornered? The answer lay in the night before. Oscar had told Frank the spirit transplant succeeded, even if the spirit was low grade. Frank, sprawled on the floor, joked that the spirit had started cooperating after Oscar's brutal training. Oscar reminded him he still lacked full control. He had yet to overcome the trauma that kept him from turning entirely into wind. Frank, uncertain, asked if winning was possible. Oscar assured him it was, but only if he used 100% of the God of Wind's power. Frank asked what that meant. He thought becoming wind was the limit. Oscar explained the spirit's hidden ability: unitization, the power to transform anything touching the body into wind, including clothes or weapons. He called it absurdly powerful and advised Frank to keep it hidden until the final moment. Back in the present, just as Laszlo reached Frank, something unexpected happened. Frank dodged with sudden precision, slipping past the attack. Laszlo's hand grasped empty air. His own necklace was missing. It now rested in Frank's hand. Stunned, Laszlo could only think, this wasn't possible. Lines stood frozen, sweat beading on his forehead, his wide eyes locked on his empty hand. The necklace was gone. Frank had snatched it so fast, so clean, it felt unreal. He watched the chain dangle between Frank's fingers in disbelief. Then, Frank placed it back into his palm with a grin and raised both hands high, proclaiming he had done it. From the stands, Grang jumped up, his face pale. He said that it was impossible. Even the healing mages had declared the relic unusable. Hama chuckled beside him, saying that it seemed the match was over. Grang struggled to accept the result. He looked toward Oscar, who was waving at Frank with a proud smile and congratulating him. Frank waved back, beaming from the arena floor. Grang muttered under his breath, repeating that Oscar had claimed to train the boy for just one day. He lowered his gaze, unable to make sense of it, then descended to the arena and approached the two boys shaking hands. With a firm voice, he said that he accepted defeat. Grang and Laszlo left quietly afterward. Hamel, watching them go, sighed and said they must have endured much to make it this far. He added it was a shame to see them leave so soon. Grang bowed respectfully, replying that it was no trouble, and asked Hamel to continue watching over his little brother. Then, with a glance at Frank, he muttered that the boy had grown, just a little. Frank blinked in confusion, not catching the words. Grang walked away, saying calmly that it didn't matter. He wasn't meant to hear it anyway. Laszlo followed, bowing politely. Frank stood silent, unsure what to say. From a distance, Oscar smirked, thinking that the boy had definitely heard it, just pretending not to. Time passed. The next morning, Frank was pale. He pointed nervously at the stone gate ahead, saying that this was the entrance. Oscar nodded. Frank pointed again, now panicked, asking how this could possibly be a training hall. It looked like a dungeon. No, like hell itself. Oscar replied casually that technically, it was used as an underground prison centuries ago. Frank grabbed his head and shouted that he hadn't done anything wrong and didn't deserve to be locked up. Oscar answered that it was a direct order from the Vice Tower Master and a sign of high expectations. Frank screamed in frustration, saying that expectations now meant solitary confinement. He protested that he'd only had one day to rest. Oscar tried to calm him, suggesting he focus on the positive. He needed time to adjust to his spirit body and reflect on what he'd awakened at level 4. As Frank was pushed toward the gate, he muttered reluctantly that it made sense, but still. Oscar cut him off with a grin, saying that he wouldn't die. Frank looked back from the dark entrance, asking if he was sure. Oscar raised a hand and gently shut the door with a final thud, replying to take care. Outside, Oscar exhaled and admitted silently that he had been the one to request it. His thoughts drifted to 2 nights ago. After the match, he had sat across from Hamel and proposed solitary training for Frank, 30 days. Hamel was surprised, pointing out that Frank had already won and questioning the need to go that far. Oscar insisted it was exactly what Frank needed. Hamel agreed with a gentle smile, saying they'd have to make it up to Frank later. Oscar thanked him. Hamel added that there was more good news. The Sirius Merchant Guild had offered their distribution network, completely free of charge. Oscar was skeptical, asking if they were serious. Then he fell silent, understanding. The guild had already done the math. If the Tower of Light came back and Frank became its core mage, their profits would be astronomical. Their motives were obvious, but Oscar admitted he didn't mind. It was good news. Then Hamel brought up another matter. He asked Oscar if he'd be willing to give a lecture. Oscar hesitated, lifting his teacup slowly. He said he could, though normally his focus was on potion development. Unless, he added, there was a reason the Tower of Light needed stronger mages. Hamel complimented him, saying he was sharp as ever. Then asked if he'd heard of the Night of the Mages. Oscar said he had. Hamel leaned back and explained. It was a day when mages from all towers would gather, meant to sharpen skills and build unity. The Emperor had hoped to forge stronger ties, but it always devolved into chaos, loud arguments and magical brawls. Oscar reasoned that it must have been discontinued, but if it was being mentioned now, something was changing. He sat up, thinking that the Emperor must be planning to revive it. Hamel confirmed it. He said the event hadn't been announced yet but would be once the new year started. He admitted it could just be his paranoia, but the Black Tower concerned him. Oscar repeated the name, puzzled. Then Hamel made a claim that stunned him. He warned that if the Black Tower sought a place among the 4 great towers, then the Tower of Light would be their first target. Even though everyone was doing well, he said he couldn't shake the unease. Oscar clenched his fists and said he would do it. Hamel blinked at his sudden shift and asked if he was okay. The memory ended. Now Oscar walked through the 36th floor courtyard of the Magic Tower. He thought that the Black Tower was rising too fast, too arrogant. He'd never allow the Tower of Light to fall behind. At least they had brought Frank to level 4. That was something. Oscar smiled faintly. That low-grade spirit fusion spell had been the key. He was still grateful that a demigod had remembered him, a powerless human who failed to keep a promise. The memory came back clearly. 2 days ago, during the summoning ritual, the old spirit master had pointed at him, shouting that no one signs a spirit fusion contract using someone else's summoning. Oscar stayed calm, asking how he was supposed to relax under the circumstances. The man had raged, but Oscar stood firm and said to tell Silifrian of stillness. The White Mage has returned. The master recoiled in shock, demanding to know what Oscar was, why the Spirit King would send orders through a mere human. Oscar rested a hand on his hip and told him that revealing the answer would ruin the fun. He asked again, deal or not? The man knelt slowly, granting permission for a low-grade fusion only. No full contract. Oscar accepted, saying that was enough, and thanked him. Just before he left, the man added that the Spirit King had one last message. Don't forget your promise. Oscar stood in front of a towering door, parchment in hand, and thought quietly to himself that this time, he wouldn't break his promise. Last time, death had come too quickly, but thanks to that sacrifice, some from the Tower of Light had been saved. Now, he said to himself, it was time to repay that debt, with interest. He looked down at the notice. Special lecture announcement. Audience. Mages under the Tower of Light topic. Re-explaining fundamental magic. Time. Every Monday and Thursday, 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. Location. Main Tower, 36th floor, Lecture Room 4. Oscar gave a faint smile and decided it was time to get to know the next generation. Inside the classroom, a young man strolled in, joking that he recognized a lot of faces and was surprised so many had survived. He walked through the aisles and asked if the class was capped at level 3, noticing no higher-level mages. A girl nearby said it made sense since it was a basic course, and another added that the tower had become more relaxed lately, especially since the Vice Tower Master himself had invited the lecturer. They exchanged excited remarks about the main building hosting the class, once a place for royal seminars, but a mocking voice interrupted. Damien Proud, son of Count Proud, dismissed their excitement and said it was just a forgotten classroom. He argued that if it were truly valuable, the lecture would focus on advanced spells, not theory. He pointed out the lack of notable students, especially one particular prodigy, and sneered that even that arrogant level 2 genius hadn't bothered to show. But just as tension rose, a pressure swept through the room. A ripple of mana silenced everything. Damien reached for his throat, panicking. His voice was gone. Footsteps approached. Oscar entered calmly and introduced himself as the instructor, Oscar Crucian. The students stared in shock. A level 2 mage was teaching them? Oscar acknowledged their disappointment and said that anyone unhappy could leave. He placed a small hourglass on the desk and stated the condition. They had 10 minutes to prove they didn't need this class. Anyone confident in their knowledge could walk out. A heavy silence filled the room. Many thought he was bluffing, sealing their voices, then asking them to speak. Obvious trap. Damien, seething, figured the silence spell must have a flaw. Oscar watched quietly, waiting. Then, with a loud smack, Damien stood and grinned, claiming victory. Oscar's eyes lit up slightly and recognized him from the rookie lists. Gifted but stubborn. He congratulated Damien, snapping his fingers to release the spell. Cheers broke out as others regained their voices. Oscar raised a hand and flipped the hourglass. Time was up. Only Damien had passed. Damien smirked and said he'd be skipping class. Oscar nodded and said it was his choice. But Damien hesitated. It was too easy. Something about Oscar's presence intrigued him. Instead of leaving, he sat back down, feigning a stretch. Oscar smiled knowingly and said that since Damien passed, he'd receive a reward. A new spell. Damien approached. When asked his favorite basic spell, he said Windcutter. Oscar asked for a demonstration. Damien conjured a sharp swirl of green-blue wind, muttering that it was a hassle. Oscar watched, impressed, then said flatly that it wasn't Windcutter. He waved his hand through the swirling mana, breaking it apart effortlessly. He explained the first flaw. The spell wasn't truly made of wind. Wind had to move, unceasing and free. Damien gasped, struck by the clarity of that idea. Oscar said that stagnant magic was like still water, prone to collapse. Wind magic, especially in the White Tower, required fluid, constant movement. Then he pointed out the second flaw. Damien wasted too much mana. Damien stared, stunned. Oscar could see that in just one cast. Oscar said that at a certain level, you see through a mage's habits. Then, softening, he revealed more. He could tell Damien had learned Windcutter by watching others in his family. He likely pushed excess mana into it to compensate for missing technique. That habit stuck. Damien stood in shocked silence. Oscar simply told him that now that he knew, he could correct it, and finally master Windcutter. He added with a wry smile that letting a student like Damien skip class would have been a waste. Damien scoffed and returned to his seat. He muttered that he never said he wasn't staying. Oscar's smile returned. 3 weeks later, the classroom buzzed with chatter. Rumors swirled. Oscar Cruciong was now being called the best instructor. Even high-circle mages were attending his sessions. Students rushed in hours early to find seats. A girl commented that class wasn't even starting until 9. Her friend replied that if they waited, they wouldn't get in. The room fell silent. Heads turned. Were those 4th and 5th circle mages in the back? Was that Elder Maxim? Then the door opened. Oscar entered, greeted them warmly, and said that today's spell was important. The class braced for something big, only for him to say it was wind magic. Groans erupted. The simplest, most basic spell. Elder Maxim raised a hand, curious. He asked if Oscar truly planned to teach wind magic to this crowd. Oscar smiled and asked the elder to demonstrate. Maxim obliged. A roar of wind filled the room, powerful and overwhelming. Gasps followed. That wasn't just wind, it felt like a storm. When the gust settled, Maxim asked if it sufficed. Oscar nodded in thanks. Then he turned to a student, Amy Lavin. She blinked in surprise. Why her? Nervously, she cast wind. A warm breeze flowed gently through the room, soft, subtle. Oscar raised a hand, catching both currents in his palm. He asked the class what they noticed. Students whispered. Range, temperature, pressure. Veronica Fricks spoke up, saying it was the nature of their mana. Oscar turned toward her and confirmed it. He explained that although the spell and incantation were identical, the mana made them completely different. One wind was scorching. The other, a breeze in spring. He then asked the class what mana truly was. One student answered with the 4 systems: harmony, acceleration, reinforcement, specialization. Oscar clarified. Those were usages, not nature. At the chalkboard, he began to write. He explained that understanding mana's essence began with harmony, especially in the White Tower and Blue Tower. Then he posed another question. Why were those 2 towers considered the heart of the harmony system? A student guessed it was due to elemental makeup. Oscar smiled and pointed, confirming the answer. Oscar stood at the chalkboard, illustrations and symbols scrawled across its surface, and began breaking down the essence of elemental harmony. He explained that while the red and gold towers produced powerful, fast magic, they lacked harmony, because in nature, there's no such thing as cold fire or cold lightning. But wind and water, they could be both hot and cold. That's why the blue and white towers represent the harmony system. He summoned a droplet of water into the air and explained how water boils. Apply 100 degrees of heat and wait. Simple. Then he shifted the droplet into steam, the surrounding air heating instantly, and pointed out that generating hot wind took even less effort. A sudden shift in temperature swept the room. One half hot, the other cold. He explained that wind is adaptable, the freest element. It can burn like fire, strike like lightning, or soothe like water. Unlike water, which can't mix with oil, wind has no such constraints. It can mirror a mage's inner nature without resistance. And said that to be true White Tower mages, students must understand their relationship with wind. Then, with a raised hand, he posed the core question of the day. How does one define wind as a living essence? Before he could continue, a low voice cut through the silence. Elder Maxim, seated at the back, was murmuring, seemingly unaware of his surroundings. One of the assistants stepped forward to check on him, but Oscar yelled to stop. Too late. Maxim's body glowed softly, his eyes unfocused, his mana spinning like a vortex. Oscar warned the class not to interfere. An awakening was happening. Maxim sat perfectly still, glowing softly, then finally opened his eyes and whispered that he'd never reached the 8th circle. But then he lunged forward and hugged Oscar tightly, laughing and thanking him. Not just as a teacher, but as someone who'd helped him see it. Oscar endured the awkward back slaps with a half smile, thinking that at least now no one under Maxim's rank would question his teaching again. As the elder celebrated, Oscar's gaze shifted to Veronica Fricks, standing off to the side with a puzzled look. He remembered her name, one of the problem students he'd marked down, but now, she was paying attention. The next day, Oscar strolled through the academy halls, thinking about Veronica's strange invitation to a training room. She'd mentioned, Fit Room A, and seemed almost disappointed when he hadn't heard of it. He remembered her looking at him like he'd admitted he didn't know how to read. He shrugged it off and found the room. Its design unlike any other, with a unique, almost ceremonial door. As he touched the surface, the door opened automatically. Inside, Oscar stepped onto plush red carpet and looked around, sensing something different. Then a synthetic voice welcomed him. It was Argo, an advanced magic tech training support system. Oscar muttered that the Golden Tower probably bled the budget dry building this thing. Argo offered to register him, but Oscar declined and continued as a guest. When prompted to select a difficulty, Oscar chose level 1. 3 orbs floated down. The task was simple. Destroy them. A snap of his fingers and all 3 orbs burst instantly. But Argo warned that wide area magic triggered special protocols. Oscar smirked, strict but useful. He raised the stakes and selected level 100. Red lights flashed. A siren blared. Argo warned that above level 80, orbs became smaller, faster, and actively hostile. Oscar cracked his neck and said that was fine. Then came the swarm. Hundreds, no, thousands, of orbs filled the space, moving at brutal speed. Oscar's objective: destroy 1,000 orbs while avoiding more than 10 hits. He responded instantly, firing pinpoint spells, conserving mana, shifting to razor-thin strikes for efficiency. His movements became a blur, dodging and countering with surgical precision. Eventually, the final orb burst. Oscar dropped to one knee, drenched in sweat, gasping. Argo congratulated him for clearing level 100. He lay back, arms spread, staring at the ceiling, thinking this generation's tools were no joke. Brutal, but effective. He stood, muttering about needing more food and more muscle. As he exited, Veronica Fricks was waiting, clearly surprised he'd shown up. She asked if he'd come because of what she'd said. He casually claimed he was just browsing and tossed in a quote about strength coming from the body, one she recognized wasn't his. She watched him walk away, suspicious. That guy, arrogant, noble-blooded, always acting superior, was suddenly different. She narrowed her eyes, muttering that she'd only been testing him. She entered the room and called for level 50 to warm up. She asked Argo to display the leaderboard. A new name sat at the top. Rank 1. EH, level 100, 957. Rank 2. Killian Rockwood, level 100, 1402. She frowned. Who the hell was EH? She asked the system directly if it was Oscar Crucian. Argo, bound by privacy protocols, repeated the same answer over and over. Veronica clenched her fists, furious. Meanwhile, Oscar limped down the hall, Sore but satisfied, from around the corner, Elder Maxim appeared and greeted him. After brief pleasantries, Maxim mentioned troubling news. Merchants in the central market had stopped buying Tower of Light potions. Oscar was stunned. Maxim suspected the Blue Tower was behind it and said he simply wanted Oscar to be informed. Oscar's demeanor shifted, jaw tight. He vowed to deal with it, but first, cursed the long line at the coffee stand. Nearby, young mages joked about pay raises and delivery assignments. Oscar listened as they casually discussed their work, how they met recipients face to face and got signatures. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just logistics, it was connection. This delivery system, though small and tedious, earned civilian trust better than anything else. That was the real value. Excited, Oscar grabbed one of the couriers and confirmed, yes, they always delivered directly to customers. He shook the mage's hand with gratitude and sprinted off. Moments later, in Hamill's office, Oscar made his pitch. He proposed using the tower's Wind Riders, its delivery network, to sell potions directly to the public. Hamill blinked in disbelief, then questioned the plan. Oscar said it wasn't just about rerouting inventory. It was about making something new. He asked for paper and a pen. He was going to invent it himself. Oscar's hand moved rapidly across the page, sketching out a new idea. He said it didn't need to be a full invention, just a clever adaptation. He pointed to a mid-tier recovery potion already known in the White Tower and proposed a rework. 4 versions, tailored by age and gender. He laid out the plan: boost growth and bones for children, energy and immunity for men, muscle support for the young, and radiant skin for women. He added that the formulas should be made compatible, allowing consumers to combine them safely. He emphasized avoiding overlapping ingredients and dosages, then suggested renaming them. Magic Potion was too intimidating. Hamill looked overwhelmed, but Oscar was already brainstorming names, trying to capture something more accessible, something that felt personal and natural. Days later, an old man named Graham sat in his garden, joints aching, lost in quiet reflection. He murmured that age was catching up. Then, a familiar voice greeted him from the gate. It was a delivery mage, grinning as he handed over a red-sealed letter. Graham's eyes lit up. The letter was from an old friend. The mage chuckled, saying Graham's generation, the century class, was too stubborn to die. Graham laughed but admitted he was feeling heavier every day. The mage, concerned, asked if he was hurt. Graham waved it off, just tired. The young man then offered a small blue vial and called it a new invention. Elixir, a miracle draft, from the Light Tower. Graham squinted at the label, asking what S0 meant. The mage explained. It meant, Senior Zero, ranked safest for the elderly, designed to boost stamina and immunity. Graham chuckled, dismissing it as just another tonic. But the mage insisted. He shared a story about Old Man Miller from Block 2, who drank it and was now planning to climb a mountain. Graham scoffed. Miller could barely walk last week. The mage leaned in and claimed it was made by Oscar Crucian, the genius behind the Cadena flu cure. That got Graham's attention. He asked the price. The mage said 1 bottle a week for just 30 tunes. Graham balked. He'd been scammed too many times. Still smiling, the mage sweetened the deal. Surin residents could get a discounted yearly plan with monthly payments, and the first bottle was free. That changed everything. Graham grabbed the vial, drank it immediately, and muttered that they should have led with that. The next day, he felt different, lighter, sharper. His body didn't ache, his mind was clear. He even rode his bike with ease. At the local square, he joined old friends at the chessboard. They teased him, assuming he'd been bedridden. He laughed and took a seat. Minutes later, he slammed down a checkmate. They stared, stunned. One asked if he was taking something. Graham casually admitted it. He'd tried a tonic from the Light Tower. They raised eyebrows, skeptical. He insisted it worked and began to explain. Meanwhile, back at the tower, Oscar was reading when someone burst in, waving a newspaper. Blue Tower had slashed prices by 50%. The assistant was panicked. Oscar smiled calmly, calling it cute. His assistant exploded, saying this was a direct attack. Oscar replied that the campaign would last 2 or 3 weeks at most. The assistant protested. They could lose their place in the market. Desperate, he He suggested bundling the Cadena flu cure with the potions. Oscar immediately refused. That was what Blue Tower wanted. A reason to paint them as exploitative. Oscar reminded him that the public's trust was more valuable than short-term gains. They still had unused stock. Oscar proposed converting it into the Zero Series supplements. His assistant was stunned. Repurpose everything? Oscar nodded and detailed a new discount model for households buying multiple products. The assistant watched, impressed by Oscar's strategic thinking. Then Oscar added a final twist. He suggested hiring the Information Guild to spread a rumor, something about M0 having stamina-enhancing effects. The assistant was skeptical. Oscar grinned and promised the results would speak for themselves. 3 weeks later, at Blue Tower, Moira Main celebrated. Sales graphs were soaring. He boasted proudly to a visitor, until the department head slapped him. He was ordered to read the morning paper. Moira's grin disappeared. The light tower had flooded the market, not with pharmaceuticals, but supplements. That meant their sales didn't register in traditional data. Moira realized they'd been blindsided. The public now saw the light tower as benevolent. Their prices looked low, but only because the products hadn't existed before. The department head pointed to the graphs. Moira had celebrated a short-term win, but missed the long game. The light tower now had consumer trust and direct access to households, and they weren't going anywhere. Moira stood pale and speechless, realizing he might be working unpaid forever to recover the losses. Far from the chaos, deep in a mountain range, warriors fought a raging ogre near a village. As they scrambled to form a ceiling formation, a cold wind swept in. A cloaked figure descended, calm and powerful. She warned the beast to return peacefully, or be reduced to dust. Her spell exploded into a vortex of slicing wind. Windborne sorcery. Dragon Tempest. The ogre was shredded in midair. When the winds died down, a warrior asked if she was from the light tower. She confirmed it and asked for a name. Zhang Chun. He bowed and handed her a folded paper from the Empire's press. She took it, then froze. She feared the worst. 2 months gone. What if the tower had collapsed while she was away? Her hands trembled. But the headlines told a different story. The light tower was thriving, leading the market with innovation and public support. Shasha Maist, Tower Master of Light, stood stunned. She touched the paper as if unsure it was real. She whispered, asking if this was fiction. Zhang Chun stared, confused. She collected herself and turned away, instructing him to send the commission fee to her account. Then, without another word, she rode the wind skyward, heart-pounding. What happened while I was gone? She wondered. I need to see it with my own eyes. Meanwhile, Lena exclaims that Oscar definitely is a mage. Oscar, taken aback, asks what she is saying all of a sudden. Lena explains that she thought the situation was really like magic, and she questions how Oscar managed to shake the Azure Tower with a single interview. She adds that thanks to him, the sales of the recovery potion have boomed, and the reaction has been overwhelming. There are countless cities other than Surin asking for the potions to be distributed there. Oscar remarks that the eternal discount strategy worked well. Lena agrees, noting that since it worked, she contacted the military to see if they'd bite, but they are ambivalent for now. Oscar explains that the military has always had a good deal with the Azure Tower, so there's no need for them to switch now. He then asks if there won't be any issues with potions for a while, and if Lena doesn't have to report to him anymore. He questions why she keeps reporting to him in the first place. Lena responds inwardly that it's because he's the potions manufacturing department head. She then asks about the performance reports. Oscar says once a month is fine. Lena accuses him of leaving all the work to her while he goes to play around. Oscar defends himself, saying he's not playing. Now that he's filled the storage room, he needs to take care of internal stability, like restoring lost magic reference books. He admits they won't take much to make, but he reflects on how much of a genius little Oscar was. He thinks that suddenly announcing high-level theory would be strange, and he acknowledges that he used the unlucky Yen's title too much. He wants to present the research using someone else's name, someone knowledgeable in magic theory with enough fame, status, and age. Meanwhile, Schwein Koch, an elder of the White Tower, is seen in a dimly lit room, muttering that he hasn't seen sunlight in a while. Another mage greets him, noting that it's been 3 months and asking about his research. Schwein Koch admits it's not going well. Schwein Koch, identified as a theory mage, laments that the magic isn't manifesting. He says he needs to present it at this year's Water Night Festival no matter what, but he still can't find the right mana resonance value. He wonders if he should have stayed in the room longer, but acknowledges that the research is difficult. Another mage points out that Schwein Koch has been researching this for 7 years now. Schwein Koch agrees, saying that as long as he can find the resonance value, he can succeed. The other mage suggests using an assistant, like Oscar Crushen, for example. Schwein Koch dismisses the idea, saying it's not research a level 1 mage would understand in the first place. The other mage defends Oscar, saying he's level 2 now and that he worked so hard. Schwein Koch recalls that she used to hate Oscar, accusing him of showing no results and just sucking money out of the tower. But now, she admits that was before. She says Schwein has been busy researching and doesn't know the recent news in the White Tower. He asks if Kosh hasn't noticed that the atmosphere in the White Tower has changed a bit. Everyone's complexions look better. Schwein jokes if they won a lottery or something. Blondie says they can consider it a lottery. It's thanks to Oscar Crushen's potential finally being used. He laments that the other mage should have seen it while it happened, calling it a shame. Schwein asks if what he is saying is that Oscar is good at alchemy. She exclaims that Oscar isn't just good at making potions. There must be a ghost of a businessman possessing him because he's good at that too. He adds that Oscar is also so good at lecturing that no one would think he's a level 2 mage. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Oscar is on the level of a high-ranking mage when it comes to theory. Schwein tells them to calm down and agrees to meet Oscar since they keeps recommending him, but warns not to expect much. Schwein Koch clarifies that he's not looking down on Oscar, it's just structurally difficult. He explains that even looking at the same thing from the first floor and the rooftop is different when it comes to information gained. In other words, even if Oscar is a genius, a level 2 mage's view has a limit. He adds that what he's researching right now is on restoring the innate magic of the genius of all geniuses. Later, Schwein Koch conducts a sudden test for Oscar. He introduces himself as Schwein Koch, one of the elders of the White Tower, who majors in theoretical magic and is recovering lost magic. He explains that he's been working on some research but doesn't think he'll be able to complete it alone in the allotted time. It's already taken 7 years so far. He says he feels sorry for asking Oscar to take a test when he's the one asking for a favor. Oscar reassures him that it makes no sense not to look at someone's abilities when searching for a researcher. Schwein praises Oscar's incredible attitude and gives him 50 minutes to complete the test. Oscar accepts, saying he'll do his best. He thinks to himself that with Elder Schwein around, no one will care about a level 2's research contributions. He finds the test easy, reasoning that a level 5 or 6 theory mage would solve it easily. Based on the questions, he deduces that Schwein is looking for a researcher to help him catch basic errors. Schwein Koch observes Oscar, surprised that a level 2 mage is solving the test so quickly. He mutters that Oscar is already on the last page, which he finds impossible unless Oscar can think similarly to and knows the concepts of a high-ranking mage. He wonders if maybe Oscar is upset that he can't solve the problems and is half-assing them, saying Oscar must be surprised. Those questions are on another dimension of difficulty compared to the others. Oscar thinks that these are the magic he created and is surprised that some materials of his magic still exists. Soon he hands the test sheets to Schwein. He praises Oscar's work, but then his tone turns disappointed. He notes that Oscar wrote the answer to the last question without even solving it properly, which frustrates him. He admits he wanted to see how Oscar would approach the questions if they researched together, but to not even try because the question was difficult. His expectations had been raised because Maxim recommended Oscar, but now he feels let down. He reviews the answers and confirms in shock that they are all correct so far. He remarks that this is something one would need to be at least an academy professor to do, yet a mere level 2 mage accomplished it. He wonders just how impressive Oscar's arithmetic abilities are. Schwein Koch then asks Oscar if he thinks his answers to the last question are correct. Oscar, slightly taken aback, confirms that they are. Schwein Koch presses further, questioning which of the 4 mana values Oscar wrote down. Oscar explains that he used the fluid mana value and asks if he approached it wrong. Schwein Koch's eyes widen as he processes Oscar's reasoning. He realizes that, based on the structure of the formula, a unified mana value would cause errors, so Oscar solved it using a fluid mana value that would change according to the process. He hurriedly grabs the papers and declares that they can use these values to test the magic immediately. A moment later, Schweinekoek is visibly shocked, muttering in disbelief, "How can this be?" He turns to Oscar with newfound respect and exclaims that he will have Oscar as the co-author of the thesis rather than just a supporting researcher. Overwhelmed, he thanks Oscar profusely. Oscar, piecing things together, hesitantly asks if the magic Schweinekoek was researching was the one from the last question he solved. Schweinekoek confirms it, revealing that it was the magic created by the previous generation's magic tower master, Oscar Sage. Schweinekoek then questions why Oscar Sage recovered this magic, even though he looks so young. He explains that this magic only requires the user to expend mana once, creating a nearly unlimited supply of wind and directly defying the law of conservation of mana. He calls it a perfect, infinite mana source in theory, hence its name, Ouroboros, representing endless circulation and eternity. However, Oscar admits that by his standards, it is a failure. He reflects on how humanity, which conquered land and water, could not reach their final location, the sky. He reveals that the aim of the Blue Sky Project was to develop an aircraft during the war against demons, with Ouroboros meant to act as its power source. While the magic theory was near perfect, it still did not produce enough energy to power an aircraft. He points out that there are many other magics one could use instead if it wasn't for something as energy-intensive as an aircraft, questioning why Schweinekoek spent 7 whole years on it. Schweine's thoughts drift to Shasha, and he considers telling her quickly. He thinks that the foundation stone of the delivery business has been prepared and wonders how happy she will be. But then Oscar interrupts, shocked, asking if the reason the Tower Master created the delivery service was for this magic. Oscar, realizing the implications, thinks to himself, Shasha, no matter how much you missed your master, how could you make him recover this without even deciding? Schweinekoek, however, reassures Oscar, telling him that he is the one who fulfilled the longtime wish of both the Tower Master and himself. He declares that this is the first step to opening the Sky Path. They've taken their first step in 7 years. But then Oscar hesitates, asking if Schweine is trying to repeat the same challenge from the past. Schweine says yes, Ouroboros will act as an engine, but Oscar interjects saying that it is impossible to fly an aircraft using only the wind generated by this magic. Based on records from the past, a proper aircraft could never be created with just Ouroboros. Schweine, undeterred, counters that the situation now is different from 23 years ago. His eyes gleam with determination as he thinks of the advancements in magic engineering as he points to a modern lamp.